So good afternoon, everyone. Now, yesterday we were talking about the movement against. Okay. So yesterday we had talked about the social reforms, right? We had broadly completed the discussion on the social reforms. Now, what we are going to talk about today is the formation of the Congress. Okay. Now, firstly, we are going to talk about the formation of the Congress from 1885 to 1905. This is the period that we'll firstly talk about. Yeah. In? See, one of the things that you have to understand, the class is not merely a regurgitation of your textbook. The class is not merely a regurgitation of your textbook, that whatever is written in the class, in the textbook, has to be repeated in the class. Because there are many things done in the class which are not given in any of the textbooks. So class is not merely whether I come to the text, where you pick up a textbook and then you start seeing, Acha, this is done in the class, this is not done. Because there are many things which are done in the class which is not done in the textbook also. That is one thing. The second thing is, you will get another handout which will list many other organizations also. And we've done some, I would say, 10 or 12 major organizations like Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, or the Sayyid Ahmad Khan, or partly about Vivekanand Theosophical Society. We've covered some, or Jyotiba Phule, Savitribai Phule. We've covered some 10 around major ones. Okay. There are endless number of other social organizations and individuals. Now, basically, I'll keep covering a few more organizations from time to time, as and when they come in between of different periods. Because when we'll come to 20th century, then we'll talk about the role of Periyar, Justice Party, Ambedkar. So that we'll cover in 20th century. In terms of what we have talked till now is 19th century organizations, not 20th century. Okay. When we'll come to the 20th century, we'll talk about 20th century organizations. Also, there will be a separate handout which will bring a number of names and a number of journals, newspapers started by different individuals. Now, there's nothing to tell ki who started Rast Guftar, who started this newspaper. It's simply factual information that you have to mug up. I'll just give you all them in one place in a handout that will be uploaded, so that you don't have to run around searching them. But there's nothing to explain there that who started the first newspaper. If you go and read the PowerPoint presentation, there have mentioned that the Calcutta Madarsa was started by this individual, this Hindu college was started by this individual. But there's nothing much to explain there. So that is largely a factual information that you'll get, and you just have to mug it up. There's nothing more to explain there. Our focus is not merely on regurgitating facts, but also more on analysis as to what kind of questions can be asked. Now, when we talk about the formation of the Congress, we are going to look into 2 or 3 things. Firstly, we'll talk about some of the initial founders of the Congress and their views and their opinions, which today we classify as the moderates and the extremists. Also, we'll talk about what is also commonly known as the safety valve hypothesis and the lightning conductor. The safety valve hypothesis and the lightning conductor hypothesis. These hypotheses talk about what? The safety valve hypothesis and the lightning conductor hypothesis talk about theories that explain about the origin of Congress. Okay. So, the moderates and the extremist viewpoints, the safety valve hypothesis and the lightning conductor hypothesis, these are the theories which talk about the origin of the Congress. And then the Council Acts of 1861 and 1892. Okay. The Council Acts of 1861 and 1892. These are, now this topic what we're discussing today is predominantly important. These things especially are more important only from your prelims point of view. And the differences of the various viewpoints of the Congress is important from both prelims and mains point of view also. There have been questions about moderates, etc. in your mains examination also. So I'll tell you what exact kind of questions can be asked in a minute. Now, when you, let's start a discussion firstly briefly about who formed the Congress, etc. And now some basic facts about the formation of Congress is Congress is formed in 1885. The first session of Congress is held in Bombay, and it is actually led in the first session by W.C. Banerjee, Umesh Chandra Banerjee. Okay, so that is one thing. But beyond that, let's first briefly talk about who formed the Congress, because this is something which is important to understand. Now, the first thing that you should note about the formation of Congress is who formed the Congress. Now, if you go and you'll read the PowerPoint presentation, which will get uploaded today, I have mentioned a number of pre-Congress organizations also. It's not that the Congress was the first organization formed to bring together Indians who were making demands to the British. No, Congress was not the first organization. Rather, there were a number of organizations formed before the Congress also. And I've given details about the East India Association, okay, or about the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, who formed. What you need to know from a prelims point of view, who formed these organizations, okay. And for example, there is the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, there is the East India Association. East India Association was one of the first organizations formed by Dadabhai Naoroji, centered primarily in London, and to pick up issues related to Indians. Similarly, there was the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha formed by M.G. Ranade. Similarly, there were other organizations formed by Surendranath Banerjee, Anand Mohan Bose. A number of Indian nationalists were active on the scene much before the Congress was formed, during the 1870s also. And the Congress was formed in 1885. And it is these individuals who had formed, a number of these organizations later went on to form the what? Congress. But what differentiated Congress from a number of other organizations was that these pre-Congress organizations were largely centered either in Bengal or in Bombay. And Congress was to be an organization which was to be a pan-Indian organization, bringing together nationalists from throughout the country on one common platform. So while others like Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, etc. were more regional in their approach, Congress was to be a pan-Indian organization. That is what differentiated the Congress. And those who formed the Congress were the ones who were already active on the scene of nationalist politics. Now, firstly, these initial founders of the Congress, whether you had people like Badruddin Tayyabji, you have people like many others, Surendranath Banerjee, Anand Mohan Bose, Umesh Chandra Banerjee, a large number of these individuals were English educated or Western educated upper middle class sections of the Indian society. They had completed their higher education in London and in Britain for considerable period of time. Okay. Now, why is this point important? And a large number of them also, a predominant number of them were also whom? Lawyers. Okay. A predominant number of them were also lawyers, and some of them had a flourishing practice of law as well. So these individuals were Western educated upper middle class individuals, and a number of them were prominent lawyers also at this point of time. Why is this point significant? Why do you think I am emphasizing this point? It would only represent a particular section, interest of a particular section of the Indian society. Anything else?
This statement was also quoted by the Governor General of the India, and this emphasized that the Congress was for the mainly elite class, not for the people.
So, what is saying is that this basically signified the fact that Congress was primarily representing the interests of the elite sections of the Indian society rather than the interests of the masses. Anything else you can think of? They were lawyers, so they would understand legislations and all related things better. Anything else? See, often we say that the class composition of any organization often determines its demands as well as its approach on any issue. For example, and that is, it's going to be easy to understand here. These are upper middle class educated sections of Indian society, okay, and they are lawyers also. Now, if this is partly going to determine their approach. देखिए, बड़ी simple सी बात है. Suppose you have a problem with practical, देखिए ना, इसमें कुछ ज़्यादा मुश्किल नहीं है समझना. Suppose you have a problem with rising fuel prices. Do you go out on the streets? Do you pick up arms against the government? No. Why? You are upper middle class of the Indian society, educated also. So what are you more likely to do? Express your dissatisfaction through what? Press, through the media, right? So there are mediums of expressing dissatisfaction, but your methods of expressing dissatisfaction will be different from that of a peasant. A farmer is more likely to get out on the street rather than you. Why? Because you have more interest, you are more likely to express your dissatisfaction through what? Through other means rather than getting out on the streets. Are you likely to pick up arms? No, it's very unlikely that you will pick up arms against the government. Why? Because do you have any prior training in arms? Do you have any background that can give you an easy training in arms? Yes or no? No. So, often the strategy followed by any organization partly is determined by the composition of that organization. If the Congress was formed by individuals similar to you or individuals similar to you and me, then it was like largely to follow a strategy also similar to you and me. That they were not the ones who were getting out on the streets demanding an overthrow of the British rule. They were not to pick up arms against the British. Why? Why don't you get out on the streets? What will happen? Firstly, your parents will tell you, पढ़ने के लिए भेजा था, नेतागिरी करने के लिए नहीं. Secondly, what is it going to do? It can expose you to what? A police crackdown. Right? ऐसा तो नहीं है कि पुलिस बोलेगी आओ आओ. Right? It can expose you to a police repression. Secondly, you are more likely to make resort to, even if you are to protest, what is the route that you are likely to take? PIL, file public interest litigation. Yeah? Use what? A judicial route. Right? So these individuals too are lawyers. What do you think they are going to use? They are also going to use largely what? Constitutional or legal mechanisms, or argue for legislative changes rather than getting out on the streets at a time when the British had already introduced a law on sedition. The British had already introduced a law on sedition, and if they had introduced a law on sedition, getting out on the streets demanding an overthrow of British rule was politically suicide. Why? Because the British could imprison you on the charges of sedition, or even crack down on what? Or even could launch a police crackdown on your activities. So either you could be in jail on sedition or you could be in hospital. And then what would happen to your practice of law? Right? Your professional future is finished. Right? अभी आपके ऊपर एक बार सेडिशन लग गया तो हो गया यूपीएससी आपका तो. Right? So in that context, what do you see? That the approach of the upper middle class is largely often governed by their limitations as well as their experiences. Given that these individuals had more experience in dealing with matters of law and were a large number of them were lawyers themselves, they had more exposure to using legislative or constitutional mechanisms for arguing for change. Also, they had limited faith in the ability of what? A mass movement yielding anything against the British, because either it could be repressed or they could be charged with sedition. So they are not the ones, the early founders of the Congress are not the ones who advocate going out on the streets, who advocate public speeches, or who advocate an open what? Challenge to British rule. That is what is there about their strategy. What about their demands? If they were to make a demand for a direct overthrow of British rule, they would again be charged with sedition. So rather than making a demand for overthrow of British rule, they are doing what? They are demanding a reform of British rule. They are demanding a reform of British rule rather than its overthrow. They are demanding that the British rule must become more responsive to whose demands? To the demands of people. Okay? And what were the demands that they made? They made the demands that the civil services must be thrown open to whom? Indians. Indianization of civil services. Increasing representation of Indians in civil services. They demanded what? That protection must be provided to Indian industries. By doing what? Increasing the custom duty. On what? Increasing the custom duties on imports. So that is the kind of things that they are demanding. They are demanding increasing the custom duties on imports so that Indian industries are provided protection. They are demanding that civil services may Indian representation must be increased. Also, we will talk about these council acts later. They are also demanding that legislative councils, and I'll talk about them more detail later. Legislative councils were some sort of a legislature, like you see Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha today. Not exactly similar, we'll get into the details later. But some representation for Indians and greater representation for Indians where? In legislative councils also, or in legislative bodies also. So they are making demands for inclusion of more Indians in every political and administrative sphere. They are not making a demand for the direct overthrow of British rule. They pleaded loyalty to the British, but at the same point of time argued for reform of the British rule rather than its overthrow. Because arguing for overthrow was almost, in their view, a political suicide, as it would not yield anything and it would just expose them to British repression. Okay. So, what do you think? It is these early founders of the Congress whom we are calling as the moderates, because they are moderate in their demand. They are not demanding the overthrow of British rule, rather they are demanding its reform. And we call them moderates not just because of their demand but also because of their approach in putting forward their demand. They are not supporting what? They are not supporting any open public protest against the British. Rather, the strategy that they were to use was to principally rely upon whom? The press. Did we talk about the press before, the Vernacular Press Act and all? No. We'll talk about that today. Okay. That the vernacular, that basically they relied upon. देखिए कैसे होता है? अभी मिडिल क्लास आप हैं, आपको सरकार की कोई नीति नहीं पसंद आ रही कि पेट्रोल का प्राइस बढ़ रहा है, तो आप क्या करें? आप फेसबुक पे लिखेंगे, आप ट्विटर पे लिखेंगे, यू विल राइट ऑन फेसबुक, यू विल राइट ऑन ट्विटर, और बड़े आदमी ब्लॉग लिखेंगे, और बड़े आदमी तो क्या होगा? न्यूज़पेपर में लिखेंगे, एडिटोरियल लिखेंगे, और बड़े आदमी तो टीवी पे जाके बोलेंगे. That is all that will you do? That you will use often, the upper middle class makes use of what? Press. To basically do what? Spread their views, and it is in this context, spread and vocalize their concerns also. So it is the Congress who are also what? Upper middle class educated sections of the Indian society. They are using which instrument to spread their views? The press. And it is at this point of time that basically they wrote a number of articles to they wrote a number of petitions to the British. They wrote a number of articles critical of British policies and arguing for a reform of British policies from time to time in a number of newspapers. And thus the press became one of the first vehicles of Indian nationalism. Press became one of the first vehicles of Indian nationalism because it was with the press that the aim was to what? To build pressure partly on the British. But article तो आज भी लिखते हैं लोग. Newspaper में article आप देखते हैं. आप if you start reading Hindu and Express for 6 months or a year, what will you see? Most articles are suggesting reforms or a wholesale dumping of government policy. तो आपको क्या लगेगा कि सारा ज्ञान तो सरकार के बाहर ही है, कि सबको ही जो आ रहा है वो रोज ज्ञान दे रहा है सरकार को, राइट? सो थ्रू एडिटोरियल्स एटसेट्रा, राइट? एडिटोरियल्स, आर्टिकल्स, इंटरव्यूज एटसेट्रा, राइट? सो इट इज इन दिस कॉन्टेक्स्ट दैट ऑफन what do you see? Why is it that the press is called the fourth pillar of democracy? Because it is through which a continuous what? Medium of exchange of views is going to happen between the government and the people. The government also tries to reach out to the people through the press, informing them about their policies, about their intentions. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि मोदी जी भी आर्टिकल लिखते हैं, वेंकैया नायडू भी आर्टिकल लिखते हैं, right? So even government functionaries also write articles from time to time to reach out to the masses. But also the press also becomes an instrument in the hands of the masses or the educated middle class predominantly to reach out to the government. So this is the same strategy that is being used by the press here. The early Indian nationalists relied upon the press to do two things. One is to communicate to the government their concerns, but also to do another thing. Why do you think articles are written in newspapers? To inform the government, to spread the masses, to basically politically educate the masses and to spread political consciousness amongst whom? Masses. That is why the press is considered one of the pillars of democracy, or the fourth pillar of democracy, that it will help to politically educate the masses. So even the early Congress leaders are looking to what? Use the press to reach out and politically educate the Indian masses. And though they argued for reform of British policies, indirectly they are also educating Indian masses that the British rules and its policies are beneficial or not beneficial. They are not very beneficial for the Indian masses, and thus is trying to build what? Nationalist consciousness. But they are trying to build nationalist consciousness primarily through the use of press, not by getting out on the streets or giving public speeches openly to begin with. Rather, they wrote, that is, their strategy was to rely on prayers, petitions and protest. Prayers, petitions and protests, all were being done through what? Press. Whatever protest also they had to do, they would write articles against it or against government policies from time to time. Not coming out on the streets, not arguing for a direct overthrow of the British rule. That is what were the early founders of the Congress. They were moderate in their approach, they were moderate in their demand. But moderate in extreme is always relative. So they are moderate in relation to the younger generation which joins the Congress, and that is whom? Extremists. That we'll talk later. Is this much clear? Yes. Yes. We'll come to that about the role of the press in a minute. That what is the role? She's asking that did the British allow the press to operate in such a manner? Or what is the role of the British? Or what is the British attitude towards the press? We'll come to it in a minute. Okay, let's first write down this, then we'll come to it. Okay. So, you give the heading, formation of the Congress. In 1885, Congress was formed as a pan-Indian. Congress was formed as a pan-Indian organization Congress was formed as a pan-Indian organization which aimed to bring together Indian nationalists on a common platform These early founders included Surendranath Banerjee, Anand Mohan Bose, दादाभाई नारोजी, सुरेंद्रनाथ बैनर्जी, आनंद मोहन बोस, दादाभाई नारोजी और बदरुद्दीन तायब जी। अभी अब कोई लिमिट नहीं है इसकी। एमजी रानडे, ठीक है, हो गया है ना। सो दैट इज देयर। आई हैव गिवन सम मोर नेम्स इन द पावरपॉइंट प्रेजेंटेशन, यू कैन हैव अ लुक एट देम। ओके, in the next para you write, these early founders came from an upper middle class. These early founders came from an upper middle class, had received Western education, in Europe. And argued for implementation of political or slash you can write granting of political freedom and civil liberties to Indians at par with whom? With the British counterparts. With their British counterparts. Next para. These early founders of the Congress are termed as moderates. These early founders of the Congress are termed as the moderates. These early founders of the Congress are termed as the moderates as they relied upon the use of constitutional legal methods, to argue for a reform of did we write? And legal method to argue for a reform of British rule. Rather than its to argue for what? A reform of British rule rather than its overthrow. Okay. In the next para you write, the moderates primarily relied upon the use of press to spread political consciousness amongst Indian masses, and largely refrained from public speeches and advocating an overthrow of British rule as they feared a police crackdown. So, you can write in the next para. While making demands for reform of British rule, they argued for A. Indianization. Of civil services. B. Increasing. Why am I telling you this? क्योंकि प्रीलिम्स में कैसे भी क्वेश्चन पूछ सकते हैं. That with respect to moderates, which of the following statements are true? They demanded the overthrow of British rule. No, that's a wrong statement. That they demanded the Indianization of civil services. Yes. So you should know the specific kind of demands they picked. Okay. So Indianization of civil services, increasing representation for Indians in where? Legislative councils. Okay. Or C. Increasing representation for Indians in legislative council. C. Also, strengthening civil liberties or what? Freedom of press. देखिए, they are relying upon the press to reach out to the masses and make their demands known to the British. So what are they obviously going to argue about? The freedom of the press. And D. increasing import tariffs to provide protection to British to Indian, to provide protection to Indian industries. So these are the kind of demands that they are making, right? तो अभी देखिए, there is one thing that I have told you, that Congress is essentially dominated by people who are upper middle class. अभी इसमें क्या peasant का issue है? There is nothing. That basically shows the immediate issues that dealt with whom? The peasantry. So what? So basically, is this an organization which is actually picking up the needs of the masses to begin with? No. It is anti-imperial in nature. It is demanding a reform of the British rule. But the concrete demands that it picked up is essentially the concern of whom? The Indian middle class. And the upper middle classes of Indian society. अरे civil services में कौन जाएगा? Upper middle class. और increasing representation of Indians in legislative council, वहाँ भी कौन जाएगा? Upper middle class. Okay, and we'll focus on more of them later. Strengthening civil liberties and freedom of press, that is also essential. Yes, but it is also, the freedom of press is often used by whom? The upper middle class to voice their opinion, right? So, I mean, this is just one way of to look at it. When people talk to you about what is the pressing issue for you, people say reservation in jobs. Arre, reservation in jobs, in government jobs is a concern for whom? Who are writing exams for government jobs? Who are they? Upper middle class और middle class section of the Indian society. आपके जीवन का पहला concern है कि गवर्नमेंट जॉब में रिजर्वेशन है कि नहीं है. It is not the concern of the masses, because the masses have little access to education. For them, the major concern is what? Agriculture or the growth of manufacturing, because that is what is going to yield jobs to them. Okay, so you never are really concerned about MSP for farmers. Why? Because you are not a farmer, right? So it is in this context that what do you see? That these kind of demands showed that Congress to begin with is essentially a middle class organization. It is not an organization which has reached out to the masses. Is that clear or not? Anything you want to ask on this? Right? So this is one thing about moderates. Now let's talk about the press. Okay. Now here what I am telling. Yes. Yes. No, now I am saying that yes, this is what is happening, is that essentially yes, the press is to reach out to the masses, but who is trying to reach out to the masses? The upper middle class sections of the society, and it is trying to, now fun thing, dekhe, this is partly a criticism also of the Congress, it's partly also a nature of the Congress to begin with. So Congress is starting out as a middle class organization. It doesn't remain a middle class organization all its life. We will emphasize this repeatedly, that the Congress of 1885 was different from the Congress 20 years later of 1905, is different from the Congress of 1920. Okay? So it evolves over time. And yes, when it is starting to use the press, initially they are making the demands which are there of the middle class. They are trying to spread the view amongst the masses that the British rule is a problem. But the immediate issues that they picked up were more of the middle class concerns. But at the same point of time, through the use of press, etc., they were reaching out to the masses. And soon there was a realization that unless the Congress was ready to pick up the issues of the masses, it could never get what? Support of the masses. Okay, so it evolves over a period of time. Just to share something with you, just because you asked. Jawaharlal Nehru writes in his autobiography about the evolution of Congress. And Nehru did a considerable part of his education in London, etc. So he came back to India, and it is in 1912 that he did what? It was in 1912 that he attended the first session of the Congress of his life. Okay, his father Motilal Nehru was already one of the well-established lawyers in India, and Jawaharlal Nehru attended a session of the Congress, his first ever session of the Congress in 1912. Now, Nehru writes in his autobiography that when he attended the 1912 session of the Congress, it did not seem any different from a meeting of Indians in London or in the colleges of London, because most of the people who assembled for the Congress session were all dressed in Western attire, coats, hats, etc., and were communicating largely in English. It did not differ very much from a Western club or a Western a gathering of Western educated groups of Indians, etc. It did not seem like an organization which had much in common with the rest of Indians. Okay, that is what he is writing he is writing about his experience of his first ever session that he attended for the Congress. But Jawaharlal Nehru was also a good orator, and at the same point of time was a good writer. And people who are good orators and writers have good political future. Nehru was also one of them. There are many around us today who are good orators, even if they are not good writers. Oration se bhi ho jata aajkal ka. So, but Nehru was a good writer also. You can hire a good writer, you can just narrate it well, right? But Nehru was a good orator and a writer, and he said that between 1912 and 1921, Congress had undergone a dramatic change, okay? And not merely there was an interchange of numbers, right? There was not merely an interchange of numbers, but rather a change within the nature of the Congress itself, where he says that in 1921, when non-cooperation movement was about to begin, Gandhi was there, etc., and the meeting of the Congress was called, it was very different from his first ever memory of Congress. And in 1921, nobody was dressed in Western attire. Everybody was dressed in khadi. They were predominantly using for communication either local languages or Hindi, etc. And Congress had undergone a shift from from its dressing style to the kind of ways in which they carried out their operations. Congress had undergone a shift. Also, and this reflected in the issues that Congress picked up. By 1921, Congress was talking about picking up peasant issues and picking up peasant demands, which reflected what? Congress desired to build a base amongst whom? Masses. And masses were whom? Peasantry. So that is something that is happening over time, okay, not to begin with, right? Initially they are trying to reach out to the masses, but the concern, अरे आप अभी देख लीजिए प्रेस में कितने articles आते हैं about the concerns of the masses? Very few. Most articles are about अरे इसने चौका देखिए एक I fail to understand why sports and sports में भी cricket, is sports का 2 पेज हर न्यूज़पेपर में है. इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस का कितना पेज है आपके न्यूज़पेपर में? 1. और वो एक भी ऐसा है पूरी दुनिया उसी 1 पेज में, और आपका क्रिकेट 2 पेज में. वो किसका कंसर्न है? मिडिल क्लास का. क्रिकेट तो मिडिल क्लास का ही कंसर्न है. और फॉर एग्जाम्पल यू सी व्हाटएवर इज हैपनिंग, अरे किसी की शादी हो गई, किसी का बच्चा हो गया, किसी का ये हो गया, वो हो गया. So, just while they are using the press to reach out to the masses, it isn't that the press is actually reflecting, to begin with, also the concerns completely of the masses also. That is that. Now let's talk briefly about the press, because ये press वाला angle भी important है from your prelims point of view also. In the mains also they can ask you, but definitely in the prelims, some of the details about the British attitude towards the press. Did the British allow the press to function freely? Now, till 1830s, there was a need to do what? Obtain a license. You can write this with me, okay? Till 1830s, there was a need to obtain a license before you could start a newspaper. a legal permission and license was required from the British before you can start a newspaper. Often such permissions and licenses would not come across very freely. Okay? Such permissions and licenses would not come across very freely, and without license you could not open a newspaper. So do you think that there was too much freedom of the press? No. It is only in 1835 that under Charles Metcalfe, a Metcalfe Act was introduced. Under Charles Metcalfe, a Metcalfe Act was introduced. Okay? And it is this, under this Metcalfe Act, that basically the restrictions on the press were lifted. The restrictions on the press were lifted. How? The restrictions of the press were lifted by ending the licensing. The restrictions on the press were lifted by ending what? The licensing regime. And basically no longer a license was required to open a newspaper. An individual could open a newspaper without requiring a license or anything of that sort. So what do you think is being introduced? Freedom of the press. And that is why Metcalfe's lifting of the restrictions led him to be recognized as the liberator of the Indian press. In 1835. But as I always say, that the true test of freedom of speech and expression comes only when you have offended somebody. अरे जब तक offend नहीं किया है जब तक तो ठीक है ना. ऐसे parents say, as I always say, हाँ हाँ बोलो. जहाँ आपने बोलना चालू किया हाथ से निकल गए हो तुम. यही सीखा है क्या तुमने? So, is this what you have learned? This is unacceptable. How can you even think like this? So, freedom of speech within the four boundaries of home are all as long as you have not offended your parents. So, my parents used to tell me, you should study very hard. I always had two questions to ask them. Did you study very hard? They said, obviously. Yes, studied very hard. I said, it doesn't seem so, I would say. Because if you would have studied very hard, I would not have required to study. कि आपने बहुत पढ़ लिया होता तो आपने बहुत नाम, बहुत पैसा, बहुत सब कुछ कमा लिया होता तो फिर मैं chill कर रहा होता. मतलब you've not done your job properly. They're like, we have raised you, we have given you everything you need, and you are here telling us, how can you think like this? Freedom of speech is gone. It's just an impression they give कि आपका है freedom of speech. Now, yes.
The newspaper were also used to convey the message to the government officials or leaders.
What? The
Newspaper were also used.
हाँ.
So sir, we can also write.
अभी रुक जाइए, अभी और है प्रेस में बताने को. So, in the sense that this is something that was the policy in 1835. Now, this is largely the policy that continued till the 1870s. But soon, during the 1870s, what was happening was a number of new newspapers were being set up. As nationalist activities were picking up, a number of new newspapers like the Hindu, like many other newspapers were being set up. And these newspapers were the ones which were being set up not as a commercial enterprise to make money or profits, but they were being set up at often great expense to the Indian nationalists themselves, who were putting in their hard-earned money to or their resources to start newspapers, from where they were not making any major economic gains, but primarily as instruments to reach out to the masses. And the British government saw through this exercise that the rapid proliferation of the press was happening, and this was often happening in local language newspapers in a rapid way. English language newspaper circulation did not increase very much, but local language newspaper circulation increased in a drastic fashion. Why? Because it was, anyways, literacy was limited in India, and whatever literacy was there, it was largely in the local languages. So if one had to reach out to the masses, you had to reach out to them in newspapers in the local languages. And the British government looked at this proliferation of local language newspapers with a certain amount of concern. And that is where they argued that something had to be done to clamp down on this proliferation of the press, which was increasingly nationalist. A large number of them were being run by nationalists who were spreading basically ideas and discontent against the British rule. So to clamp down on these proliferation of newspapers, etc., the Vernacular Press Act was introduced by Lord Lytton, who was the Governor General or the Viceroy at this time, in 1878. Okay. So the Vernacular Press Act was introduced at this point of time. This Vernacular Press Act okay, what is it? Vernacular. Now this Vernacular Press Act was introduced by Lord Lytton, Lytton. Okay. It basically aimed to impose restrictions on local language newspapers, and aim to impose restrictions, not ban, but only restrictions. What were these restrictions? A written affidavit had to be submitted by these newspapers that they would not publish what? Any anti-British views, or they would not indulge in any anti-British activity. I think this kind of affidavit newspapers must sign today also, right? That they should not publish anything which is anti-government, or not anti-government, anti-national. Right? They should not publish anything which is anti-national. Right? There they said that if you publish something which is anti-British, you are breaking the affidavit, and you will also have to submit a bond surety of 50,000 rupees. And if you, to whom? To the district magistrate of that district. Okay. And if any party was found violating the affidavit, then their bond money of 50,000 rupees and their machinery would be confiscated. So abhi ऐसे ही होना चाहिए. That the day a newspaper is found publishing anti-Indian articles, then what should happen? Their machinery also must be confiscated. उनको बंद कर देना चाहिए. Editor को उठा के जेल में डाल देना चाहिए. That is what the British are also saying. इसमें क्या बुरा है? It is meant to be satire. अगर आपके समझ में आया तो बहुत अच्छी बात, नहीं आया तो कोई बात. That the Vernacular Press Act is basically imposing these kind of restrictions, which amounts to what? Censorship of the press. अरे सरकार ही बताएगी कि एंटी नेशनल क्या है, तो फिर किसी चीज की जरूरत ही नहीं है. जुडिशरी की भी जरूरत नहीं है, किसी की जरूरत नहीं है. बस ठीक है, ऐसे एफिडेविट लिखवा लो सबसे कि ना आप देखिए, गवर्नमेंट ऑफिशियल साइन दिस एफिडेविट. Once you become a civil servant, etc., you cannot openly air any anti-government views. Otherwise, there is a code of conduct, etc., which can be invoked against you, and all those things are there. So, as a code of conduct must always also be there for the media. Khatam hai fir. If you take away the freedom of press, that is all that you require to do. the British were imposing these restrictions, and this was something that was what? This was something which was opposed by what? The early nationalists, including the Congress. Okay. So a number of these restrictions which were being imposed, but they were to apply only to local language newspapers. Why only local language? Why? Because the reach was bigger, and also because the British government argued that these newspapers are the ones which are irresponsible section of the media. They don't know how to behave. Okay. So the responsible section, we are not imposing restriction, which is the English language newspaper. Okay. So again wahi baat. If you are doing nothing to offend the government, ठीक है, ऐसा है तो फिर क्या है फ्रीडम ऑफ स्पीच? फिर तो बस ये है कि गवर्नमेंट ने क्या कर रही है ये आप लिखते रहिए, बस, that is it. Then you being responsible, you are telling to the people what government is doing for vikas, right? So that is the, now it is in this context that देखिए अभी मैं आपको आगे एक और थ्योरी बताऊंगा, उसके बाद हम थोड़ी बात कर सकते हैं इस पे, आप कॉन्ट्ररी व्यूज भी रख सकते हैं, कोई डाउट नहीं. So the Vernacular Press Act is saying this. The Congress is opposed to the early nationalists who later go on to form the Congress are opposed to the Vernacular Press Act, and it is in 1880 that Lord Ripon repealed the Vernacular Press Act. It is repealed in 1880 under Lord Ripon, and it is because of the Vernacular Press Act that one of the prominent Bengali language newspapers, the Amrita Bazar Patrika, converted from the Bengali language to the English language to escape the repression of the Vernacular Press Act. The act was repealed in 1880 under Lord Ripon. A few more things about Lytton you must know, and Ripon also, from your prelims point of view. Both of them are important governor generals. Okay, Ripon is also the one, if you remember, I told you before also, had introduced what? Ilbert Bill, we discussed, right? Lytton was also the one under whom there was also the introduction of what was called as the Arms Act. This Arms Act is also saying that it is restricting the popular carrying of firearms. It basically said that if you need to carry firearms, you needed a government license. It aimed to restrict what? Access to firearms. Why? Because the British were of the opinion that they wanted to prevent any kind of a possibility of a larger armed revolt against the British. So the Arms Act was aimed to impose this kind of a restriction. Then apart from Arms Act and Vernacular Press Act, Lytton also was responsible for organizing what was called as the Delhi Darbar. During the 1870s, 1876, etc., he is who's organizing the Delhi Darbar, in which I told you before that the Queen assumed the title of the Kaisar-e-Hind. Okay, so he organized the Delhi Darbar in 1876 in Delhi, which was a grand royal function in which the Queen visited India and adopted the title of the Queen Empress of India. But it is also at the same time when famines were happening in India, and especially in North India. Okay, so when famines were happening, especially in North India, that is why. So this was a grand display of British power and wealth, even while a number of Indians were suffering from food shortages and famines. And this is something which caused a lot of resentment amongst people, and also resentment against policies of Lytton and actions of Lord Lytton. So Lytton was considered a more repressive ruler, whereas Ripon was considered a one with a more relaxed attitude towards Indians. So ये broad आपको पता होना चाहिए. What do you see that the Congress, that in the 1870s there was an attempt to what? Limit the freedom of press, as it was seen by the British as a threat to their rule. Okay. So that is what is there about the freedom of the press. चलिए आपसे कुछ और. In India, do you think the press enjoys freedom? From whom? From the government. The biggest threat to freedom of press today is not government control, is corporate control. 80% of the media houses, more than 80% of the media houses today, directly or indirectly in India, are owned by one family, the Ambanis. Directly or indirectly, the India Today group, which includes Aaj Tak, this, etc., etc., their shares are held by the Reliance group. You look at NDTV. NDTV has taken a role of 250 crores from Reliance. The day Reliance wants that loan back, NDTV has two options, either to give operating control to Reliance or to go bust and announce a shutdown of their operations. Almost all major media houses in India, the whole first post wala jo business hai, that is completely owned by Reliance. Almost all major media houses in India today, CNBC, either are owned by corporates or today also been owned by many big political houses. Okay, you go in South, that is there, Nadu TV, this TV, that TV, all of them are owned by a number of political houses. Okay, so if anything, the press does not enjoy a lot of freedom, and that is very clearly visible in the manner in which the Rafale deal is being probed. कोई media house ऊपर से दो लाइन के अलावा, no investigative journalism is happening in the Rafale deal. And a number of such examples are there, okay, where certain news don't get published or are published only with, merely a very thin coverage. So, ऐसा नहीं है कि freedom of press है कि नहीं, freedom of press and is considered very integral for any democracy. चलिए खैर, paid news बहुत सारी चीजें, लेकिन that is it, yeah. Why? So they don't need to, the British also have a number of subordinate officials. They don't need to learn all the languages. They have a number of subordinate officials recruited from amongst Indians, whose job is to aid and assist the British in carrying out their task, right? So that is that. Anything else? So this is something that you need to know about the press. And these things are important from prelims examination. Questions on Vernacular Press Act have been asked before in the prelims examination. Okay, they can ask you a question that with respect to Lytton, which of the following statements are true. Okay, they can give statement on Arms Act, Vernacular Press Act, and other things also. Okay, Delhi Darbar, all of these things. This reminds me also one more thing. When public memory is very short. You remember कि 1876 में there was famine, and while the Delhi Darbar was being organized, which showed what? Poor timing, right? It perhaps showed a poor timing on the part of the British. But I'm very sure you don't remember something. When demonetization was happening, there was a very grand wedding organized. Of whose? Reddy's is one. Not Jetli. Gadkari's daughter wedding was organized while demonetization was on, and there was a limit on how much one could spend on marriages, and Gadkari's daughters getting marriages, choppers are coming, this, that, etc. There was a limit, I don't remember exactly, but I think there was a limit of 5 lakhs or 10 lakhs on weddings that they could basically withdraw for these kind of purposes. But Gadkari's daughter's wedding happened super lavishly. Okay, and that is what was there. So many people criticize then that this is poor timing for BJP. Forget whether it is demonetization is good or bad or not, but it is poor optics for the party. But public memory today is very short. And many would have forgotten. But कोई बात नहीं, हमारा काम है याद दिला देंगे. So now that is there. The next thing that we are talking about is the next generation within the Congress. Those who were the early founders of the Congress were being challenged during 1890s onwards by those who were the younger generation, the younger blood of the Congress, who had joined the Congress relatively recently. and it entered the nationalist activity relatively afresh. Okay, these were people like what is also called as the Lal Bal Pal trio. Lajpat Rai, Lal Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Right? So this trio of Tilak, Lajpat Rai, and Bipin Chandra Pal were also called as the younger section of the Congress, which were the more extremist sections. Extreme relative to whom? The early founders or the moderates. What was extreme about them? Their demands as well as their approach. They argued that nothing is going to be achieved by demanding the reform of British rule. Rather, we must argue for overthrow of British rule. So they were more extreme in their demands. They also argued that nothing is going to be achieved by letter writing pratyogita. By merely writing letters to the editors and writing articles in newspaper, nothing is going to change on the ground level. Because if something substantive was to change by writing merely articles in the press, then तो सारा change आ ही जाता. ऐसे जैसे आज भी है. Articles are written. Every economist, macro economist worth their salt, including the new IMF appointed, जो said what? That demonetization was a bad policy. Though many prominent newspapers have not prominently published Geeta Gopinath's statement, but she said as much as taking over in the press conference, that demonetization was a bad policy. But ये तो सब कह रहे थे. Every economist except for prominent other economists like cricketers, right, like film stars, who have another super excellence in economics without studying economics, they said that demonetization is a good policy, but no macroeconomist worth their salt, Indian or otherwise, has said that demonetization was a good policy. No macroeconomist has said. Everybody else who was not an economist has said so. Right? So it is in this context that many number of such articles were written, but things change merely by writing articles or what? No, that is what, who argued? Extremists. The extremists argued that this letter writing pratyogita is not going to take you anywhere. And if we need radical change, we need radical measures. Radical or more extreme measures. And extreme measures here, extremism does not mean violence. Contrary to what you may assume, extremists here does not mean that they are giving a call for the use of violent methods. They are saying that the masses must be involved. Nothing can be achieved without involvement of the masses. And masses must be involved in arguing for a overthrow of the British rule. For involving the masses, we must do what? Give direct public speeches. Give public speeches directly and try to speak out and reach out to the masses directly. How do you involve the masses? If not by giving them arms, how do you involve the masses? They said that if masses are to be involved, we should use the instruments of what often later came to be associated with Gandhi, like boycott of foreign goods and adoption of Swadeshi. Boycott of foreign goods and adoption of Swadeshi. This is what he supported, that these extremists supported. They said involve the masses, go out on the streets, demand the overthrow of British rule, involve the masses, do public protests, burn foreign clothes, boycott foreign goods and adopt Swadeshi. These are the ways through which we can build more pressure on the British. So their strategies are relatively more extreme as compared to the early founders whom we term as the moderate. Extremism here does not refer to the use of violence or force. Okay? Extremism here does not refer to the use of violence or force. When we will talk about the use of violence, we will talk about militant nationalism. Okay? And extremism is always a relative term. Extreme related to whom? Somebody else. Right? So extremism necessarily does not mean violence. Okay? That is why the definition of sedition and the interpretation of sedition says, when you argue for the overthrow of the state, that is not sedition. When you argue for the overthrow of state through armed means, that is what is sedition. अभी मैं बोलूं कि सरकार चोर है, सरकार को उखाड़ फेंको, that is not sedition. Because I am not saying that use force or use violence, etc. But if I am saying that use force or violence, that is what is armed overthrow. So extremism can also be in shades. Somebody can say government can be reformed. Somebody can say it cannot be reformed, it must be overthrown. So who is saying that it must be overthrown is extreme as compared to whom he is saying it is can be reformed. That is why they are called as extremists. They are saying that British rule cannot be reformed, it has to be overthrown through involvement of masses, through giving public speeches. But the moderates are saying what? You do any of it, what will it lead to? Crackdown by the British. And the nationalist activity and project will be over before even it can, what? Before even it can begin. Okay? If you try to do any of these things. That is what is the viewpoint of the moderates. The extremists are arguing but this. And these people are the ones who we know as the extremists. Okay? And Tilak was one of the most popular of the extremist leaders. It is in 1897, and there is also something that you can write separately. In 1897, Tilak gave, we had already talked about this, that Tilak gave a number of speeches, right? Used the Ganpati and Shivaji festivals to give a number of public speeches. Tilak enjoyed a certain degree of popularity amongst the youth. Of some of the early members of the Congress, Tilak was perhaps one of the most popular Congress leaders who had a popularity amongst the youth. And it was here that he gave the speech which inspired the Chapekar brothers. We had talked about this? No? Okay. So it is here that he gave the speech in 1897 in one of the Shivaji and Ganpati festivals in and around Pune that inspired the Chapekar brothers. Okay. What was said here that inspired, what he said was that just like Shivaji had thrown away the outsider, and he was referring to Aurangzeb, just like Shivaji had denied Aurangzeb to settle down in this region for a long period. In a similar, just like Shivaji had thrown away the outsider, we should also throw away the Britishers. Okay? And this, one of these speeches inspired the Chapekar brothers who assassinated the plague commissioner of Pune. Okay? Who assassinated the plague commissioner of Pune. Actually, in 1897, a plague outbreak had broken out in Pune, and it was here that plague was something that would spread, especially in densely congested areas. So, it is at this time that the plague commissioner had ordered the clearing of slums, and it was in slums that a large number of people resided. So, a forced eviction of slums was being done, and large number of people were being displaced because of the orders of the plague commissioner, and this was causing a hardship to a large number of people. And it is at this point of time that, inspired from one of the speeches of whom? Tilak, that the Chapekar brothers assassinated the plague commissioner for his poor handling of the situation, to send a message out to the British. As a result of this, obviously the Chapekar brothers were captured, but more importantly, Tilak was charged with causing disaffection against the state and was given a jail term, and he was in jail for the next year from 1897 to 1898. Tilak became one of the first Congress leaders to go to jail. तो क्या होगा? जेल जाने से क्या होता है? Popularity बढ़ जाती है. So Tilak was one of the first Congress leaders who went to jail, and also his popularity increased primarily because he advocated a more direct approach of challenging the British rule. So that is there. अभी इसी पे एक ऐसी, there was this Marathi movie. It's a very good movie. It's a must watch because it comes with English translation, so you can watch. है ना? Quote. This movie received a lot of awards, etc. Right? And what happens in this movie is that there is and the Hindu carried a number of articles on this movie. मैं आपको क्या लगता है बार-बार मैं पिक्चरों के बीच बारे में क्यों आ जाता हूँ? कि मेरे को बहुत fascination है पिक्चरों से. There was once a essay topic in 2013 or 14 in your main examination that cinema is a reflection of society or an agent of social change. Okay? So when you are looking at cinema, etc., you can look at these kind of things also. So in this movie, basically what is happening, and the main actor in this movie, his interview also was published in the Hindu. This movie came, I think, 2014 or 15, okay, or maybe a bit later also. And in this movie, basically what is shown is that there is a poet philosopher, okay, and this movie based in Mumbai and areas around Mumbai. Okay, so this individual is given a number of public speeches in the slums of Mumbai. Okay, where he says, for example, that the sewage cleaners, etc. Okay, for he is giving a number of these speeches in the slums of Mumbai, and in some of these speeches, he argued that these all cleaners, etc., whether they are sewage cleaners, garbage collectors, etc., all of them must commit what? Suicide. He says that you are anyways going to die very soon. I mean, the many studies which have shown, right now also, that the life expectancy of cleaners, sewage workers, etc., is much lesser. 80% of them die before even achieving the age of retirement. Okay, so pension तो वैसे भी उनको नहीं मिलता है, पहले ही ऊपर चले जाओगे तो pension कहाँ से मिलेगी? So, anyways, basically he is arguing, one of the poems is saying that all these cleaners, etc., must commit suicide because anyways they will die sooner or later because of their work itself, the hazard associated with the work, and their life condition is anyways miserable. इनका कुछ तुम्हारा कुछ नहीं हो सकता. You should commit suicide. Then one of the fellows, one of the sewage cleaners actually commits suicide. So who's blamed for abetting suicide? This poet.
सुसाइड नहीं किया था, वो ड्रिंक किया था सर, फेस्टिवल था, वो सब हुआ था, भाषण दे रहे थे ना, लास्ट में सिविल में पाया गया था.
पिक्चर देखेंगे कुछ के पिक्चर. So basically he is charged with abetting suicide. Okay, he is charged with abetting suicide, and then the matter goes to the court. Okay, then Indian courts. So this fellow is at the same time under many cases because he has given many such speeches in some places, and wherever there were some deaths or the other happening, this fellow is charged with a number of cases on number of grounds for his speeches being inflammatory, causing trouble for the government. So it's basically a kind of a satire also. It also basically looks at how issues related to caste, etc., which may seem to have disappeared, have not disappeared, and how the evolution of caste and all of these things in modern society. It's a pretty good movie. It received a lot of awards also, national awards also, by Chaitanya Tamhane, I think, the director of the movie. So, and he was a pretty young director, one of the youngest ever to receive national awards, 29, 30 years of age. So, I mean, this movie received a lot of acclaim. Now, so there's something of this, right? Tilak is giving a speech, and Tilak's popularity is witnessing a certain amount of rise during the 1890s. Okay, that is something about the new blood within the Congress. But the first 2 decades, from 1885 to 1905, the first 2 decades, the Congress is dominated by whom? Moderates. It is only in 1905 onwards, especially in the movement against partition of Bengal, that what is happening? That the extremists assume charge of the Congress or take up a more active leadership role within the Congress. That happens only after the first 2 decades. Okay, so for the first 2 decades, largely the Congress was not a mass organization, did not give any large public speeches, did not organize any large public gatherings or any large public protests. Rather, it did not even openly argue for an overthrow of the British rule. That is what is there from 1885 to 1905. You can first write down about the extremists. During the 1890s, the younger generation of the during the 1890s, the younger generation of the Congress during the 1890s, the younger generation of The Congress, represented by leaders like the Lal Bal Pal trio, represented by leaders like the Lal Bal Pal trio, Amar Akbar Anthony, represented by the Lal Bal Pal trio, argued for a more radical shift, argued for what? A more radical shift, argued for a more radical shift in British policy. Argued for a more radical shift in Congress policy. Argued for a more radical shift in Congress policy for tackling British rule. For tackling British rule. They argued for an overthrow. They argued for an overthrow rather than a mere reform, of British rule. They argued for an overthrow rather than a mere reform of British rule. Okay. Moreover, they supported the involvement of masses. By the use of public speeches and instruments like boycott of British goods and adoption of Swadeshi. These techniques were put to use primarily during the movement against partition of Bengal. Primarily during the movement against partition of Bengal in 1905. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but you can just write it here. Next para. The extremists criticized the moderate strategy. The extremists criticize the moderate strategy as ineffective The extremists criticize the moderate strategy as what? Ineffective and argued that moderates had reduced nationalism to the level of an academic pastime. Moderates had reduced nationalism to the level of an academic pastime. मतलब आए आपने एक बार बातचीत करी, कुछ आर्टिकल लिखे, हो गया. Okay, that is what they said. Moderates had reduced nationalism to. Now, before we go any further, one of the things that you must understand, that when we assess the role of moderates, if you are forming the impression that moderates were useless and they had made no major, contributions to the growth of Indian nationalism, this is perhaps an inaccurate assessment. There were shortcomings of the moderates, but there were contributions as well. Okay, and this is something that Dadabhai Naoroji said in as many words. Okay, that Naoroji himself was a moderate leader, and Naoroji said that in terms of the early founders of the Congress, their contribution was what? Their contribution was that they laid what? The foundation of Indian nationalism. Secondly, they retained focus largely on what? Political and economic demands. आपने देखा? Indianization of civil services, freedom of the press, more representation in legislative council. Is there any invoking of the culture, identity, religion, etc.? So they retained focus largely on political and economic demands, and thus were the ones who gave birth to, in a way, what? Secular nationalism. But despite their positive contribution, they had a number of weaknesses as well. What? They had failed to do what? To raise issues, what? Concerning whom? Concerning the peasantry or the working class. ये masses कौन हैं? कौन हैं ये लोग? Right? That is what even politicians keep saying today, that we are working for the benefit of whom? Masses. अरे कौन हैं ये masses? Everybody thinks that who is the mass? They, Indian middle class. You think that who are the masses? You are the masses. Arey, you are not the masses. You hardly constitute 2 to 3 to 4% of Indian population. Maximum 5. Arey, 95%. 1% is the elite. You are somewhere in the middle. 4 to 5%. Rest is the mass. You are not the masses. ऐसा सुनने में बुरा सा लगेगा कि आप आम आदमी नहीं है, आप हैं खास आदमी. ये बात अलग है, आपसे भी खास आदमी है ना? So in the context, they failed to raise issues concerning the peasantry or the working class. So this is what is basically responsible for their inability to give what? A mass orientation to whom? Mass orientation to the Congress or the nationalist struggle to begin with. This is their weakness, and also the limited and also their weakness is what? Their reluctance in involving the masses through public speeches, etc. So, but this does not mean that the moderates had no contribution. Just to tell you, देखिए, ऐसे भी आप इस बात को समझ सकते हैं, failed to raise issues concerning peasantry and working class. Inability, it was primarily their weakness was inability to provide a mass orientation to the Congress to begin with. Okay, that is what their weakness is. Want to write? You can write this down. Okay. Now, this is something which is being done. Now, if you think that moderates were not doing some big deal, you have to understand that even today, देखिए अभी भी आप अगर ज़्यादा आपने कुछ खुल के बोल दिया या लिख दिया तो बहुत कुछ हो सकता है ना. There are many laws that can be enforced against you if there is an unlawful activities prevention act, sedition, ये वो दुनिया भर का. Okay, there have been many cartoonists etc. in India itself, independent India, who have been charged with sedition. There have been many other anti-nuclear power plant protesters. अभी की बात नहीं कर रहा हूँ मैं, क्योंकि अभी तो आप हैं, अभी तो आप कुछ देख रहे हैं. मैं तो उनकी बात कर रहा हूँ जिन पे लग चुका है कई बार और बाद में फिर 2-5 साल बाद केस खत्म हो जाता है. So a number of such individuals who have been very vocal or critical, they can also be repressed by the government. Back then, the British were not very known for their very sympathetic attitude towards Indians anyways. So to talk openly anti-British was itself a matter of danger. Okay, so it is not a very easy feat to argue for, you know, a change in British policy or a reform of British policy also. So they were already constantly under a fear of repression. Okay, on top of that, they are the ones who are bringing us squarely a focus on political and economic issues, staying away from religious and cultural issues. So it is in this context that their contribution is not insignificant, but yes, it was thus only merely laying the foundation which the later generations were to build upon. And Dadabhai Naoroji said in as many words that the extremists of today will be the moderates of tomorrow. Okay, that abhi those who are looking at extremists in 1890s, their demands and strategies will seem irrelevant to many a few generations down the line. Okay, or a generation down the line, their strategies will seem irrelevant to many. Okay, so he's basically saying that there is no contradiction between moderates and extremists. It is that moderates' role is different and extremists are going to build upon the work done by the moderates. Okay, that is there. आपके में क्यों इतनी बकवास करता? Mains examination question last year was about moderates and their reluctance and their failures. There is a question. ऐसे नहीं कि कुछ भी बस लगे हुए हैं सर को काम धाम नहीं है इसी पे moderate extremist में ही लगे हो. There is a reason. Okay, so these kind of questions have been asked before also. एक और ऐसा ही question पूछा गया that various ideologies have influenced the Indian freedom since its inception. We say that 1880s onwards there is the growth of Indian nationalism, and there since then you see what there are different ideologies and different strategies suggested by different sections, including within the Congress. That is what is there, and we'll talk about this more later. So this is about moderate extremists. तो आपको प्रीलिम्स में भी सीधा सीधा क्वेश्चन आ सकता है और मेंस में भी आ सकता है. Okay, now talking about the two other things, they are relatively very easy. The first question is that why did the British allow the formation of Congress? Why did the British allow the formation of Congress? देखिए, firstly, the British had no time machine. In 1885, the British did not know that maybe in the 1930s and 40s, the Congress would be a source of much trouble to them. अगर time machine होता, तो बात अलग थी. So time machine is not there. So they cannot predict the future, firstly. Secondly, why did the British allow the formation of Congress? Is because, and what are the explanations given for allowing the formation of Congress? Are the safety valve hypothesis and the lightning conductor hypothesis. Now, this is not very difficult to understand, and you can write this with me. Okay, that basically okay, so basically why did the British allow the formation of Congress? There are two competing explanations for it, and both revolve around one fellow, A.O. Hume. Okay, A.O. Hume was a retired British civil servant. Okay, he was a British civil servant who had retired and had stayed back in India after retirement also. देखिए कई लोग के रिटायरमेंट के बाद जीवन में बहुत टाइम होता है ना. So he stayed back in India after retirement primarily because he had a certain degree of fascination for India, Indian culture, Indian biological diversity also. Okay, for example, he became a member of the Theosophical Society. Also, he was one of India's foremost ornithologists. He basically loved birds and basically documenting the various varieties of birds in India. ऐसे लोग आज भी ऐसे भरतपुर सेंचुरी में जाए तो लोग इतना बड़ा बोले कैमरा टेलीस्कोप पता नहीं क्या क्या होता है उनके पास, उस पर देखते रहते. मैं भी झांका एक बार, क्या देख रहे भाई, हमें भी देख रहे. So that is there. So there is a Bharatpur wildlife sanctuary, right? So it is in this context that he was. Why am I telling you this? Is also because of a reason that so he was one of a famous ornithologists in pre-independent India. He collected a large number of bird samples from India, which were later preserved in the London Museum of Natural History. Okay. Similarly, one of the most famous ornithologists of post-independent India was anybody? Salim Ali, right? So Salim Ali also basically documented. He's also played a very important role in the conservation and the setting of the Bharatpur wildlife sanctuary. Okay, and also he was one of the foremost founders of the Bombay Museum of Natural History. Okay, so that is ये सारी चीजें भी आपको कुछ कुछ पता होना चाहिए ऐसे लोगों के बारे में थोड़ा थोड़ा, क्योंकि ये सारी चीजें भी प्रिलिम्स में आ जाती हैं कई बार. Okay. Now it is coming back to A.O. Hume. A.O. Hume had a certain degree of fascination and had a certain degree of interest in India and had stayed back after retirement. देखिए रिटायर्ड लोगों के जीवन में काम कम होता है और टाइम ज़्यादा है ना, और सिविल सर्वेंट जब रिटायर होते हैं तो उनके जीवन में गजब आइडेंटिटी क्राइसिस आता है, क्योंकि टिल द डे बिफोर आपके आगे 5 लोग, आपके पीछे 5 लोग है ना. आप जहाँ जाएंगे दरवाजे खुल जाएंगे, लोग बात सुनेंगे, पीपल विल पे अटेंशन टू यू. जितना सीनियर उतना ज़्यादा अटेंशन यू विल गेट. बट द डे यू रिटायर कोई नहीं जानता आपको, कोई नहीं पूछ रहा. एक बार मैं मेट्रो में जा रहा था तो मैंने देखा मेरे बगल में कोई आके बैठा, मैंने बोला ये तो कोई देखा हुआ है. एक RBI गवर्नर YV रेड्डी, I क्रॉस चेक्ड फोटो YV रेड्डी, हाँ यही. बोला सर आर यू YV रेड्डी? यस सर. बड़ा आदमी है बहुत है ना. तो मैंने बोला सर वेरी नाइस, व्हाट एल्स कैन आई से. So basically once you retire as a civil servant or as some there is a certain degree of जीवन में टाइम है, कोई पूछे तो अच्छी बात है. तो A.O. Hume was approached by whom? The early founders of the Congress. A.O. Hume was approached by the early founders of the Congress and asked him, do you have spare time and would you want to be a founding member of our organization that we are looking to form, which will bring together a number of Indians on one common platform to voice their views from time to time. And that is A.O. Hume was approached. So what will A.O. Hume say? Okay, yes, why not? Right? So A.O. Hume agreed to join Congress as one of its founding members. Now why did the Congress approach the A.O. Hume? Okay, that is one thing. So basically we say that Congress approached A.O. Hume for certain reasons. Why? That will come to in a minute. But A.O. Hume became one of the founding members of Congress, and he then A.O. Hume communicated to the Viceroy at this point of time, Dufferin. To Lord Dufferin, A.O. Hume communicated what? That these Indians are looking to form the organization. I am also joining it as its founding member, and don't be concerned. Why? Because this organization is basically composed of these Western educated upper middle class Indians. They are not a threat to British rule. Rather, they are mainly going to write few articles, essays, letters, etc. And I will also be there as a founding member. And so we should be doubly assured that it is not going to be any threat to the British rule. They are not giving public speeches. They are not coming out on the streets. They are not demanding the overthrow of British rule. They were merely deliberate and be voicing their opinions through press, etc. from time to time. Okay. That is why what? The Congress is not a threat to the British rule. Why is he communicating this to Dufferin? So that the British government does not launch a crackdown on such a organization. So, and Dufferin is partly convinced by the explanation of AOUM. He sees, Dufferin sees Congress is nothing but what? Congress is primarily a safety valve. देखिए, you have pressure cooker. अभी pressure cooker में होता है safety valve CT होती है, right? Which allows what? That when pressure steam starts building up, it releases excess steam, prevents the pressure cooker from bursting. So it allows the pressure cooker to do its job without suffering an explosion. So what is? Congress is like a safety valve, which will allow educated upper middle class Indians to come and let off their political steam and feel that they have expressed their opinion. It will give them a forum through which they can express their discontent. And this is something which will serve as a safety wall. It isn't a threat because they are not coming out on the streets, nor are they arguing for the overthrow of British. But it will give them some sense of participation. ऐसी है, Facebook, Twitter, अभी आपके जाके लिखने से फेसबुक पे कि पेट्रोल सस्ता हो जाना चाहिए, पेट्रोल सस्ता नहीं हो रहा है, लेकिन आप लिख रहे हैं, मतलब शायद, है ना? तो in that context, what does it do? It allows you to let off your political steam. But does it threaten the rule of the rulers? No. Right. So it is, Congress is also something that is serving as a safety wall, which is giving a sense of participation, allowing them to express their discontent without threatening the British rule. So that is why the Cambridge historians argue that to begin with, Congress was merely a safety valve. And that is why the British allowed its formation, because they did not see it as a threat to British rule in any concrete manner. That is what is the safety valve hypothesis. What is the other hypothesis? The other hypothesis is what is the lightning conductor hypothesis. What is the lightning conductor hypothesis? The lightning conductor hypothesis basically says something else. What? It says that the Congress never challenged the label, and this explanation is given by more nationalist historians, and Bipin Chandra also supports the lightning conductor hypothesis. They say that the Congress never openly challenged the label of being a safety valve. Why? Because by being labeled as a safety valve, what are they doing? By being labeled as a safety valve, it is helping them to escape what? British repression. Okay? So they never openly challenged the label of a safety valve, but the Congress was actually not merely a safety valve. In fact, the Congress relied on using whom? AOUM as a conductor to decrease what? The resistance of British rule. देखिए बड़ी सिंपल सी बात है. I'll write down, then you can write down, don't worry. देखिए ये अपने इलेक्ट्रिक सर्किट पढ़ा होगा, उसमें एक कंडक्टर होता है, एक रेजिस्टेंस होता है. रेजिस्टेंस allows the flow of electrons easily? No. Resistance does not allow the flow of electrons very easily, but conductor does. So for smooth conduction of electricity, you need conductors and less resistance. So by AOUM being in the Congress could convince the British that they do not mean a threat to the, they could give the impression that the Congress did not or was not a direct threat to the British rule. If Congress could give the impression to the British by including AOUM as its founding member that it was not threatening British rule. The British would allow Congress to function with relative ease and would not resist the formation of Congress. But without AOUM, the Congress could face much bigger resistance from the British about its intentions, about its actions, etc. So including AOUM was considered necessary by the Congress. Why? To decrease whose resistance? British resistance. So who was serving as a conductor? AOU. That is what is the lightning conductor hypothesis. Okay. So if the British looked upon the Congress merely as a safety valve, the Congress looked upon AOUM as lightning conductor. देखिए AOUM क्या था? AOUM was in a way double agent. Whose side AOUM was actually on is very difficult to say. Many argue that AOUM convinced Dufferin that Congress is not a threat, it is merely a safety wall. And the other explanation is that Congress deliberately used AOUM to decrease the resistance of British rule to their formation. Who is correct? Whose side AOUM is really on is very difficult to say. AOUM is like Subramaniam Swami. You really don't know whose side he really is on. Okay. There are times when he can praise the Prime Minister, there are times when he may criticize the Prime Minister. Whose side is really on is difficult to say. But nonetheless, what you see is that there is enough reason to believe that Congress was not merely a safety wall. Why? Because especially 1920s onwards, Congress becomes one of the main instruments of Indian nationalism. Congress became one of the major vehicles of Indian nationalism during the 1920s, and it openly gave a call for overthrow of British rule, especially after 1920s. So in that Congress, in that view, the Congress is not merely serving as a safety wall, even if this was the impression in 1880s. Of whom? The British officials. That is what is there. तो आपके prelims में सीधा सीधा question आता है that with respect to the safety valve hypothesis, which of the following statements are true? Or with respect to the lightning conductor hypothesis, which of the following statements are true? That according to the safety valve hypothesis, it is AOUM who convinced Dufferin that Congress was what? Nothing but merely a safety valve. According to the lightning conductor hypothesis, Congress used AOUM as a agent primarily to reduce the resistance of the British rule to their formation. Who is correct? Who is definitely not correct is the whole safety valve hypothesis. We argue, and because Bipin Chandra ultimately comes to the conclusion that the safety valve hypothesis is not an accurate description of the Congress. Even though they did not directly challenge British rule to begin with in 1880s, in the long term they did. So that is there. Anything you want to ask on this first? Any question that you want to ask about? Is it true? मैं पूछता. It is also not true.
Some books are clearly not written about its falseness.
See, देखिए, पहली बात, एक टेक्स्ट जो आपको पढ़ना है वो बिपिन चंद्र है ना. अभी आप यहाँ पे देखिए, ये कई बार क्या होता है कि when you start reading तो एक किताब में एक चीज लिखी है, दूसरी किताब में दूसरी चीज अगर लिखी भी है तो आप क्या बोलते हैं कि अभी बंदोपाध्याय इज करेक्ट. क्यों? You've read one book, Bipin Chandra. You've read another book, Bandyopadhyay. How did you reach the conclusion that Bandyopadhyay is right and Bipin Chandra is wrong? देखिए, एक तरफ हैं दो लोग जिन्होंने अपना जीवन लगाया और उसके बाद दो किताबें लिखी. एक कह रहा है कि कांग्रेस इज नॉट अ सेफ्टी वॉल, द अदर इज नॉट सेइंग यस और नो एनीथिंग अबाउट इट. आपने व्यू कर लिया कि कांग्रेस इज अ सेफ्टी वॉल. अपने पास कहां से इतनी समझ है? मैं बड़ा सिंपल बोलता हूं, आपको कुछ नहीं करना है. ईदर इफ यू वांट टू राइट, यू कैन ultimately you can conclude what you are going to conclude, though other historians have concluded. Either you will write that the safety valve hypothesis was incorrect as described by Bipin Chandra. आपको एक कदम और आगे जाके लिखना है तो आप ये और लाइन जोड़ दीजिए that शेखर बंदोपाध्याय has been unequivocal about this hypothesis, but you cannot write the line that Congress was a safety wall. ये ज्ञान नहीं देना आंसर। हाँ नहीं, तो प्रीलिम्स के लिए अगेन वो आपसे ये पूछेंगे कि व्हाट विथ रिस्पेक्ट टू सेफ्टी वॉल्व हाइपोथेसिस व्हाट इज ट्रू, दैट व्हाट वाज द सेफ्टी वॉल्व हाइपोथेसिस सेइंग, ये पूछेंगे आपसे प्रीलिम्स में। ऐसा क्वेश्चन कभी नहीं आएगा कि सेफ्टी वॉल्व हाइपोथेसिस इज इट करेक्ट और इनकरेक्ट, ये स्टेटमेंट नहीं आएगा। स्टेटमेंट ये आएगा व्हाट डिड द सेफ्टी वॉल्व हाइपोथेसिस स्टेट, ये पता होना चाहिए आपको, है ना। क्योंकि देखिए हिस्ट्री में हमेशा देयर इज अ सर्टेन अमाउंट ऑफ स्कोप फॉर इंटरप्रिटेशन, दैट इज देयर, बट आपसे जो क्वेश्चन पूछा जाएगा उसमें ऑब्जेक्टिव क्वेश्चन में दे कैन नॉट लीव इट टू सब्जेक्टिविटी। ऑब्जेक्टिव क्वेश्चन का स्ट्रेट आंसर यस और नो में, तो वहां पे दे कांट लीव इट टू एम्बिग्यूटी, वरना फिर आंसर में वो हो जाएगा। दैट इज वाई आपसे सीधा सीधा फैक्ट उसमें पूछते हैं। अभी दैट इज वाई इन द मेंस एग्जामिनेशन दे कैन आस्क यू अ क्वेश्चन लाइक दिस, दैट टू व्हाट एक्सटेंट द लेबलिंग ऑफ कांग्रेस एज अ सेफ्टी वॉल is an accurate assessment of the Congress, discuss. So where you can give arguments of both the sides. तो आपको ये पता होना चाहिए प्रीलिम्स में कि ये क्या कह रहे हैं, and ultimately your conclusion should be that the Congress was not merely a safety wall. That is there. Okay. Now you can just simply write down about this. ऐसे ही लिख लीजिए as a table. आंसर में ऐसे नहीं लिखना है, आंसर में आप पूरा पैराग्राफ वाइज ही लिखिएगा। बट कांग्रेस basically according to the safety valve hypothesis, A.O. Hume convinced Lord Dufferin to allow the formation of Congress. A.O. Hume convinced Lord Dufferin to allow the formation of what? Congress, as it merely allowed educated middle class Indians to let off political steam. To let off political steam. Without what? Without threatening British, without threatening British rule. Clear? Without threatening British rule. The next is the lightning conductor hypothesis. The Congress did not openly challenge the label of a safety valve. Congress did not openly challenge the label of a safety valve, and yet used A.O. Hume as a lightning conductor to escape any direct what? Resistance from whom? To escape any direct resistance from British to escape any direct resistance from whom? British rule. And in the conclusion you can say that Congress was not merely or not merely a safety valve as it was termed during when 1880s, as by the 1920s it became one of the primary instruments of Indian as it became one of the primary instruments of what? Indian nationalism. Clear? So that is there. Now the last thing in this topic is, everybody is written? No? The last thing in this topic is also something which is important from prelims point of view, is the Council Acts of 1861 and 1892. What all subjects are going apart from history? Ethics is done. Ethics is more or less done. Geography is going on. Polity has started? Ma'am has not started yet. Okay. So, the Council Acts of 1861 and the Council Acts of 1892. This is something that we must first discuss. Okay. This we are discussing primarily from a prelims point of view. Mains mein koi nahi puchta hai. Now, what you need to remember is some of the factual details about this. Okay. And why are we discussing this? When you will study polity, you will see that in modern democracies we talk about something that is called as the separation of powers between the three organs of the government: the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. The executive will implement policies, the legislature will make laws. These laws are implemented by whom? Executive. And the judiciary is basically which ensure that constitution is interpreted properly, law is made and implemented within limits, etc. Okay. So that is what is there. It involves separation of powers, these three powers, and putting them in under the control of different authorities. Okay. That is what is separation of power. The parliament makes a law, the executive implements the law. Okay. And the executive, suppose, wants to introduce any new policy, etc. What does it do? Suppose the government, suppose the Prime Minister wants to introduce a new policy for health, for giving health to all, or education to all, or everything to all. Okay. So he will require to implement a policy. कहने से नहीं होगा. And for implementing a policy, he will require what? Budget. You want to give health for all. You will have to either make new hospitals, give insurance, कुछ तो करना पड़ेगा. And for that, you will need to give what? Funds. And for funds, you will need to get what? A budget passed. A budget is passed today where? In the Lok Sabha. You will see later a budget is passed by the legislature, which sanctions money for the executive to implement for a particular policy. So legislature keeps a check on whom? Executive. बड़ा superficially बता रहा हूँ. Okay. Why am I telling all of this? Is because back then, similar to executive is whom? Prime Minister. Okay. Similar to executive back then was a position of governor general or viceroy. Okay. He is the one who is in charge of all government policies, implementing all government policies, etc. The governor general or the president is whom? The governor general or the viceroy is whom? The executive. Now, today to you have Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. About the British, till 1861, there was no Lok Sabha, etc. or any kind of legislature. Rather, there were only two organs, executive, which also performed legislative functions, वो खुद ही कर लेते सब, okay, and judiciary. Legislature as a separate entity was not there till 1861. So what did Indians demand? Many a number of Indians demanded that executive is what? The one who is effectively implementing policies from day to day. So they are demanding that, Indians are demanding that in 1861 that Indians must be given some say in the administration of India. That is what they are demanding in 1861. That Indians must be given some say in the administration of India, and for this, how do you give them some say? Is by establishing what? Legislative councils. In these legislative councils, you will give Indians representation, and Indians can then voice their views on government policies. अभी पार्लियामेंट में क्या होता है? सरकार कोई नई पॉलिसी ला रही है, उसका डिस्कशन होता है. That is what happens in the parliament. Government wants to implement some new scheme, new policy, etc. It is discussed in the parliament. Its strength, weaknesses, etc. all of that is analyzed. That is what happens, right? So what does the parliament do? It questions whom? The executive, the ruling political party which is in charge of the administration. यही काम है parliament का, सवाल पूछना. किससे? The ruling party which is in charge, the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, executives. Back then, they said that first establish a legislative council so that we can ask whom questions? Governor, General or Viceroy. That is what they are demanding. Do you get this? इसीलिए मैं आपको ये पढ़ा रहा हूँ, इसलिए मैंने आपको बैकग्राउंड बताया, because otherwise I'll say first time legislative council established in 1861, तो इसका क्या ही significance है? For that to understand, you have to understand first that legislative councils were being established, the demand was being made so that Indians could ask questions whom? Ask whom the questions? The Governor General or the Viceroy. About how money is being spent, why it is being spent in this fashion, etc., etc. Hold whom accountable and answerable? The Governor General or the Viceroy. That is why they demanded the formation of Legislative Council. Now, that is the first point, that is what you should remember. That the first time the establishment of legislative councils with what? Indian representation was witnessed. For the first time, the establishment of legislative councils with Indian representation was witnessed. When? In 1861. Okay? That is there. Now, let me just explain what was the structure then. They established the Legislative Council for the first time. This Legislative Council had two types of members. One were British officials and the other were Indians. Some of the early Indian nationalists had demanded that Indians must be introduced in the legislative council must be established with Indian representation. So Indians were also introduced. But there was a problem. The problem was what? That these Indians, they were not elected Indians. Rather, these Indians were also appointed by the British. The British appointed British officials also to the Legislative Council, and they appointed Indians also to the Legislative Council. So obviously if the British are appointing Indians, to the legislative council. Will these Indians perform a very effective role in questioning the Governor General? No, they are going to be whom? British loyalists. And that is why most of these Indians who were appointed to the legislative councils were princely rulers or big zamindars. So, what you need to know is that in the Council Act of 1861, the Indians were appointed by whom? Were they appointed by elections? No, they were appointed by the British and were largely loyalists, mainly princely rulers and whom? Princely rulers and erstwhile zamindars, etc. They were the ones who were, Indians were appointed by the British and were largely loyalists, mainly princely rulers and zamindars. Okay, that is there. अभी एक तो ये हो गया. Everybody's written this? Right? So that is there. Now another thing is about how many powers do you give to the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha. देखिए अभी क्या है, फॉर एग्जाम्पल आप देखेंगे कोई भी नया लॉ बनना होता है, it has to be passed by Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Okay, every bill has to be discussed in Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, only then it gets passed and is published as a law. Okay, and basically the government cannot also spend the money spend even a single penny without getting a budget passed from the Lok Sabha. Okay, ये सारा डिटेल आप पढ़ेंगे पॉलिटी में आगे जाके. Why am I telling this again and again? Is to strike a comparison with this. Here, so budget is basically about spending money and is also about raising new taxes. Budget में सारा चीज होता है, revenue collection as well as expenditure. Okay, so budget is about both the things, revenue collection and expenditure. So while imposing new taxes, etc., all of this is presented in the budget. Now, here, when the budget is introduced, the legislative council, do you think will get any powers to vote on the budget? देखिए आज तो है, लेकिन back then when the legislative council was created, it did not have any major powers. The British government did not give any major powers to the whom? Legislative council. Why? Because they did not want any limitation on whose power? The executive or the Governor General. So they did not want any limitation on the powers of executive. So they said that there will neither be any discussion on the budget or any voting on the budget. Where? In the legislative councils. They can give the views on other bills only, and even those views will not be binding on the Governor General or the Viceroy. In one nutshell, when they are not being given the control over the budget or any major powers to put limitations on whom? Governor General or the executive or on the Governor General or the Viceroy. Do you think that legislative councils are powerful or powerless? Powerless bodies. So आपको जो prelims के लिए याद रखना है वो ये याद रखना है that the legislative councils were given no voting powers on what? Budget. ये budget वाला point बहुत important है याद रखने के लिए, because we will see that neither in 1861 nor in 1892 nor in 1919 अरे कहीं पे budget का control नहीं, was never granted to the legislative council. Because if you grant them voting rights over the budget, then if the legislative council does not approve the budget, so can the government spend money? No. Then why on earth are British ruling India? If they can't impose taxes in their own wish, if they can't spend money according to their own wish, why is it that the British are ruling India? So that is why the British had a great reluctance on giving any financial control over the activities of the Viceroy or the Executive Council to whom? to the Viceroy or the Governor General over his expenditure on executive policies, British were very reluctant to grant a control to whom? Legislative councils. So you have to remember this point as well, that the legislative councils were essentially what? Powerless and were granted no voting rights over what? The budget. And ये भी याद रखिए that the executive is not bound by the advice of legislature. कहीं भी नहीं है. As long as whatever we discuss, Council 61, 92, 1909, कहीं पे भी executive or you see the Governor General is not bound by the advice of legislative council. Okay. In a nutshell, legislative councils are powerless bodies to begin with. So that is why when the Congress was formed in 1885, Congress is saying what? That the Congress is saying what? That the Act of 1861 had created councils, but these councils require more powers and they require more representation also of whom? Indians. And these Indians who are entering the legislative council, they must be the representatives of Indian people. And for ensuring that you need what? Elected Indians. Ultimately, how do you ensure that Indians who are entering legislative council are actually the representative of people? By doing what? Elections. And putting elected Indians into the legislative councils. So, what is happening here? That for the first time, elected Indians were introduced. For the first time, elected Indians were introduced. Where? In the legislative councils. Okay. Here, for the first time, Indians are introduced, but here, for the first time, elected Indians are introduced. Now what could happen? Now what would happen? That in legislative council there were three types of people. One were Indians, the other were elected Indians, and the third were British individuals. So these two were appointed by whom? The British. Okay. And these elected Indians were the ones who were coming after elections. That is there. But say, I'm just giving you a hypothetical example. Say there were 100 such individuals. There were only 20 elected Indians. 40 were British officials appointed by the British and 40 other were Indians appointed by the British. So who enjoy the majority? Those appointed by the British. Those appointed by the British. To be more precise, actually, this was not even like this. This would be something like 50, 20, and or even more than that, 60, 20 and 20. Okay. There was what? Most of them were appointed by the British, and the British individuals are also in the majority. Okay. That is what is there. So, though Indians were introduced, elected Indians were introduced, the representation was large or small? Small. Moreover, voting rights were granted only, firstly, to men. Women were not granted voting rights at all. So 50% population is not granted voting rights. Amongst men also, voting rights were to be granted to whom? Those who owned land or property and higher education. Those who were men, the 50% population, and amongst men also those who owned property as well as higher education. So voting rights were in a way granted to what? Whom? Landed and educated individuals, which would often be what? Very less. In fact, this meant that only 1 to 2% of India's population was granted voting rights. So do you think that there is universal voting rights for all? No. There is no universal voting rights for all in the first ever elections that were held in 1892. तो आपका पहला सवाल आएगा कि sir, why is it that they are not granting voting rights to men and voting rights to women or to uneducated or individuals who do not own property? Why? Because those who own property are somewhat influenced by the British. That is why the British are only granting them property rights. There is actually a bigger reason for this. Political awareness. Okay. Exactly. This is the reason. That it is not that they are treating Indians unfairly by not granting them voting rights. Women were not granted voting rights in a number of European countries also. It is only the suffragette movement around World War I which saw a drive towards women being granted voting rights. It is only after World War I that in Britain women are granted voting rights, and even in USA women are granted voting rights late 1920s onwards. So to that extent, not granting voting rights to women was a part of the long-standing part in policy in Europe, where women were treated as politically uneducated and also inferior to men and were not granted voting rights there also. Even some of the major European political philosophers of ancient Europe had argued that women must not be granted voting rights, कि इनका काम is only childbearing etc. अभी ये political power देने का कोई scene नहीं है. And even voting rights, granting voting rights in many European democracies was not granting voting powers in many European democracies was not seen as a right, but as a privilege, which was to be given to those who were educated and informed enough to exercise it with diligence. Okay, जैसे अभी क्या भारत में, once you are 18, you may still not have the right to stay out of home after 10 o'clock. Your parents will throw you out. You are staying in, especially for women, if you are staying in university hostel, 10 बजे के बाद आपको वापस आ जाना चाहिए, because you are not sensible enough to decide whether you should stay out of your hostel after 10 or not, but you are sensible enough to elect the Prime Minister of the country. Unless you are 21, you are not legally eligible to be married in case of males, but you are sensible enough. You are not sensible enough to decide whether you want to get married or not, or should get married to a person, individual or not. But you are sensible enough to do what? To decide the Prime Minister of the country. You are not sensible enough to decide when to drink or not drink, how much to drink or drink at all, unless you are 25. But you are sensible enough to decide the Prime Minister of the country. So just because you are born and you have achieved 18 years of age and you are not mentally unstable, you have the right to vote. Which is both good as well as carries a certain amount of dangers to it. कि अभी आपको अच्छा लग रहा है कि वो अच्छे से बोल रहा है और वो दूसरा वाला नहीं बोल पा रहा है, तो आपने बोला कि प्राइम मिनिस्टर बनना बोलने की प्रतियोगिता है, जो जितना अच्छे से बोले और जितना जोर से बोले वो उतना जोर का प्राइम मिनिस्टर. So I once basically, so I normally don't do this, but once I was like very pissed and I went to a bar, sitting there, waiting for my friend. So अभी वो तो आने में देर कर रहे थे, मैंने सोचा let's make use of the time. Having a few drinks and some people are sitting adjacent to me and I was like, so I asked them, so have you ever voted? Are you of a votable age? So obviously, if you're thinking in a bar in Delhi, you have to be of a votable age, right? Like, so have you ever voted? And some said yes, some said no. I said, whom are you going to vote in the next election? So then one person suddenly becomes all conscious and speaks on behalf of everybody else. We have the right to secrecy in voting. And I was like, okay. So rather than giving a rationale, I mean, obviously, so I did not contest it any further. I was like, ठीक है भाई, पियो अपना तुम भी, chill मारो. So, but at the same point of time, the millennial generation knows that they have a right to secrecy. You ask them, why do you want to vote for somebody? If and why not? I mean, these are the kind of answers that people should have before exercising a right to vote. Yes, they have a right and it is needed in a democracy. But how diligently you are exercising, there are, questions always about that. So, European democracies at this point of time did not have an idea that just because you were born and you were 18, you must have a right to vote. They applied to their society also, applied to India also. It also obviously had a negative impact that most Indians who were entering the legislative councils were not in a way the representative of the masses in general, okay, but were the representatives of those elites, the men and the propertied class of the society. So that is one thing firstly that you must know about the Council Act of 1892. Secondly, the second point that you must know is that the legislative councils were not granted what? Voting powers over what? Over the budget. They were still not granted any financial control over the executive or the viceroy or voting powers over the budget. And the third thing that you must know is what? The third thing that you must know is that the councils were not granted voting rights over the budget. The universal adult franchise did not exist, or universal voting rights did not exist in 1892, and these legislative councils were basically elected by 1 to 2% of the population which voted, and also basically the Congress, both moderates and extremists, were dissatisfied with what? The Council Act of 1892. Bhai, why is the moderates? Why? देखिए, extremists are dissatisfied. Why? And moderates are dissatisfied. Why? Moderates are dissatisfied because they are saying कि if this is how slow there will be a gradual devolution of power, then so it will take ages. To do what? To make the executive accountable to whom? Legislature. Right? Or to make the Governor General accountable to the wishes of the people. And the extremists are saying what? That listen, extremists are saying that it has been after 3 decades, you have introduced some changes. And look at the changes that you have introduced. It is merely an incremental and very minor cosmetic change. It is not a true substantive change, because neither are you granting voting powers over the budget, nor is it that elected Indians are being elected by all the people, or are they given any major say in the governance. So the extremists are saying that this kind of cosmetic reforms are not going to give true freedom to the people. Moderates and extremists both are dissatisfied with the Council Act of 1892. They are dissatisfied with the pace of reforms and also the content of reforms. They say that too few powers have been granted and it has taken much longer, and it is a very slow, ineffective and a very gradual process. तो आपको प्रीलिम्स में कैसा क्वेश्चन आता है? Prelims may they ask you questions like this, that with respect to the Council Act of 1892, which the following statements is true? That the Council Act of 1892 granted representation to Indians for the first time. True or false? False. ये नहीं, ये दिमाग नहीं लगाना है कि sir, true representation is elected representation, and that is coming in 1892. So Indians are being granted representation in 1892. नहीं, Indians are being granted representation for the first time in 1861. Elected Indians, yes, क्योंकि अभी तो मैं आप ऐसे तो आप भी बोल सकते हैं sir, these are actually not really elected Indians because they are just elected by 1 to 2% of the population. तो ऐसा ज्ञान नहीं लगाना है. Over interpretation is not required. जो सीधा सीधा है, that is the interpretation that you must make. Elected Indians are introduced for the first time in 1892. True statement. The 1892 reforms did not grant effective control of the budget. True statement. They'll give you 2-3 statements like this and ask you to pick which of the following are correct or incorrect. Those kind of questions you must be ready for when you're doing the council acts. Is this much clear? Any doubts still here? Anything you want to ask? Yes, no? No, right? So, we'll stop. Pardon? Official majority is retained in both the acts. That is it. Now, we'll stop here. Tomorrow, we'll have a class from 2:30. You have another class till 2 o'clock, right? थोड़ा सांस वांस ले ले, खाना खा ले. So, we'll have the class from 2:30 to 5. And tomorrow, we'll talk about the next major phase from partition of Bengal onwards. 1900 till 1911. That is what we'll talk about tomorrow onwards. अभी कल से एक्शन चालू ना, सानी के सहारे मुख्य किरदार, जिन्ना, तिलक, सबका एंट्री. थैंक यू.